Hi everybody. Today we're going to look at part 1 of a 4-part series on the Code of Fair Testing. This one will focus on developing and selecting appropriate tests. Now, as I mentioned, there are 4, and these 4 come from the Joint Community on Testing Practices 2004, which is still used, still very relevant, and there will be a link at the end of this video in case you want to check it out. Now, this video will focus on developing and selecting appropriate tests. The next will focus on administering and scoring tests. The third will be on reporting and interpreting test results. And the fourth will be on informing test takers. All very important to follow these codes in order to do it right. Now, regarding specifically developing and selecting appropriate tests, there are 2 different sides of responsibility. That includes test developers who create the tests and test users who evaluate these tests before they go to the test takers. Now, test developers need to provide all information necessary, supporting evidence that shows that the tests that they develop are good, to select the right tests, in other words, good tests. Appropriate is used a lot in this because appropriateness is associated with what is good, fair, and right. Now, test users, they need to select tests that meet the intended purposes, which means that if you want to know what somebody's algebra skill set is, then you give them a test that has algebra problems in it, not a test on biology or a test on personality, because that won't give you the information you're seeking. Another important factor for test users is the appropriate test takers. You don't want to give an algebra test to a 3-year-old who has no idea what algebra is. Now, test developers need also to provide evidence showing test measurements, recommended uses of the tests that they've developed, intended test takers, the age range, the gender, whatever it is specifically that it's geared towards, the strength and limitations of the tests that they develop, as well as the level of precision or reliability in these tests. The test users, on the other hand, need to define the purpose of the test that they want to give. They need to verify that the content and the skills are there in the test, and that the intended test takers are the ones taking the tests. And they want to select appropriate test after reviewing to make sure that it does test for the intended purposes. Now, test developers also need to be responsible for including how the content and the skills in the tests are selected and how the test was developed. Test users can then use that information by reviewing it and selecting an appropriate test based on the content of it and the skills that are tested, making sure that's what they want to test with the test takers. Content coverage and intended purpose. Test developers also need to share all information, which includes test characteristics, a very detailed listing of everything, appropriateness, and test users use this to be able to review all the materials that are provided in order to select the right tests. So they need to make sure that what they get from the developers is materials that are clear, that are accurate, and that are complete in order to make the right decisions on what tests they want to use. Test developers also need to provide guidance. This includes skills that are needed, knowledge that must be had, and training that must be necessary in order to administer the tests that they've developed. Test users needed to select administrators who do have the appropriate knowledge, who have the skills, and who have the training in order to administer the test properly. Test developers also need to provide evidence of the quality, the technical quality of the test. They need to show that it's reliable, that it's valid, and the test meets the intended purposes. Test users, on the other hand, need to evaluate this evidence of technical quality, not just by what the test developers give them, but they also need to review from independent reviewers what they think of the test and if they find it to be quality too. Test developers need to provide samples, test questions, practice tests, directions, answer sheets, and manuals, and score reports to ensure that the test users have all the information necessary to make their judgment calls on appropriate tests. Now, the test users, of course, what they need to do is evaluate all of this information. They need to look at the samples, look at the practice tests, the directions, the answer sheets, make sure that they're correct, make sure the manuals are explaining everything that needs to be explained in order to administer the test. The score reports, make sure they match up, everything looks valid and reliable. And they need to do all this before they actually select a test. It's a lot of stuff that you have to cover. Now, test developers also need to avoid offensive content and inappropriate language when they're creating their test. Test users, on the other hand, need to evaluate the test, evaluate the procedures and the materials and the results of the test in order to avoid offensive content and language. In other words, you don't want to offend an administrator before they administrate the test, because that could affect them, which could in turn be a factor in affecting how the test takers perform on the test themselves. So you want to make sure that everything is good and no problem with being offended. Now, test developers make modified forms of tests and procedures available to test users when needed. And this also includes not just when they have improved a test, but modified forms of tests for people with disabilities or people who need special accommodations, such as somebody who may be blind, who needs a reader to read the test out loud to them. Now, test users select appropriate modified tests for the disabled and for special needs people to make sure that they get a fair shot at taking the test as much as anybody else who doesn't have disabilities or special needs. Test developers also need to provide evidence of performance of diverse subgroups, and make sure that these subgroups, as let's say, for example, people that are blind, they need to make sure that these performance evidence sheets have significant sample sizes for analysis, and this ensures that the performance of these subgroups equals their actual skill sets. Now, the test users need to evaluate all the evidence that are given to them by the test developers to determine performance differences that could be related to something else besides their ability to do the skills that are on the test. For example, environment. That could include anything, including loud, disruptive noises, which would be terrible for somebody who's blind when they're trying to hear what somebody is reading. So that is the end of part 1. Wow, that was a mouthful, but we got through it. Anyway, I hope this was helpful to you. I look forward to talking to you in part 2, and I hope you have a wonderful day.